So we are going to continue on the second chapter of Esther. As I said before, we're going to look at the first half of that passage. We are going to open for questions, for dialogue, and so I hope that you have come prepared with your questions. You have come prepared with your thoughts and your contributions as we take this journey of empowerment together. All right. The first half of Esther, and I while reviewing, while going through the passage, it's kind of revealing itself. Especially for the first half of this particular chapter, highlights the challenge that we have to form a theological conclusion. What we see in this group of verses is more reflective, of an historical standpoint, providing for us insight into the culture of the day and what was the process that Esther went through to become queen. And so there's just some things that I will highlight as we discuss the passage. All right. The verses 1 through to 4, pretty much gives an overview of what happened with Vashti and the recommendations that were given to deal with the situation. The recommendations given to deal with the situation. And so in verse 3, the king took the advice and he commissioned the process of finding a new queen to begin. One of the things during my preparation is that I found out that there was a time lapse between the first chapter and the second chapter. So when things went down with Vashti, the author said it took about 4 years. I think it's about 4 years after. It was about 4 years after he would have commissioned the finding of a queen to replace Vashti. And one of the reasons behind that is, as we spoke about last week, he entered in a battle to conquer the Greeks. However, he lost that battle. And he was, pretty much grieving over the loss. And so he needed companionship, he needed comfort. And so he initiated the process of finding a queen. So based on the information I encountered, it suggests that his search for a new queen was not immediate. It was not immediate. And so it took some time after. There's another dimension to the finding of a queen. And when we look at verse 12 and 13, when we look at verses 12 and 13, we realize another thing. Not only did he not pursue the replacing of Vashti until a few years after, the process of finding a queen was not an instantaneous process, but it was a process that covered at least a year. It was a process that covered at least a year. So based on what verse 12 is saying, is that for 6 months they had to go through she had to complete a 12 months of beauty treatment as prescribed for women. And so there was a 12-month process for preparing to meet the king. So there's a 12-month process for preparing to meet the king. Within that as well, one scholar suggested that there were approximately 400 candidates. And each candidate would have to spend a night with the king. In verse 13, when it was her time, so you realize that each candidate would have to go into the king for a particular night. So if we're looking at 12 years, if we're looking at 12 months of preparation, we would realize then that Esther becoming queen might have took some time. Before that happened. And so from a historical standpoint, the process of becoming queen was not one that you just jump into, or one that goes on without some process and some significant dimensions. One of the things that was highlighted is the fact that they had to be prepared. They had to be prepared, not just in appearance, but they had to prepare themselves to go through. And Esther stood out, and we're going to talk a little about that. But the question is, how did Esther manage to find herself in this position? How did Esther manage to find herself in this position? Well, that was made possible. And we're going to imply here, this is an implied theological viewpoint. We're going to imply that God had put things in place. God had put things in place for this to happen. You see, we, as believers, we cannot ignore the hand of God in our lives. We cannot ignore the hand of God in our lives. And the truth is the same for Esther and Mordecai and for the Jews in general. Because what went down here is what was bigger than Mordecai, was bigger than Esther. At the center of the biblical was the safety of the Jewish people, of God's people, who were in exile. And so as we saw with Joseph, Joseph's being sold as a slave to the Egyptians was not mere coincidence. So even though at the time we could not identify the work of God, it was not a mere coincidence. And the same thing here with Mordecai. It was not a mere coincidence. Mordecai was in exile. So that means he wasn't in his own country. But it was important for him to be there. And that is where the implied theology comes in, that God had him there for a purpose. So who was Mordecai? Well, Mordecai, as verse 5 says, he was from the tribe of Benjamin. But when you look further into his lineage, you realize that the name Matri, who was Saul's father, Mordecai would have come through that lineage. So Mordecai had royal lineage. He had royal lineage through King Saul, and through King David. So he had some royal lineage. We also know that, well, he was exiled from Jerusalem by the king of Babylon. And usually in the Old Testament, there is that idea of misogyny, where women seemingly are perceived as objects for men. But Mordecai's story paints a different picture to some extent, in that Esther, her parents had died, and Mordecai took her in, as they were cousins, but he took her in as his daughter, and he cared for her. So sometimes we look at the whole principle of women being objectified in when we read the Bible, but that is not always the case. So here we have Mordecai painting a different picture, the picture of a caring uncle or cousin, taking care of a daughter. And so Mordecai is also perceived as a wise, God-fearing man, in that when we go to verses 10 and 11, we realize that he had his head on his body. He had some wisdom. And this wisdom, I believe, comes from God. His wisdom comes from God because he provided leadership for her. He provided counsel for her. He provided the male support that is significant in shaping who she became. And we're going to see how the king just took to her. And it says something about fathers and the importance of fathers in the lives of their children, they are irreplaceable. Fathers are irreplaceable. When given the chance and when taken the opportunity to be positive role models, it provides a safe setting for girls to understand who they are and how to be treated and respected and be loved by a male, and not having to go outside and try to find um, comfort in other males and end up, getting pregnant or getting abused. And so when we contrast Mordecai's influence and Esther's behavior, we can see a clear difference. We can see a clear difference in terms of how she operated when it was her time to go to the king. And when we look at verse um, 14, when we look at verse 14, when we look at verse 13, whereas all the other women took something, because you had to take something to the king when you're going to the king, and she did not take anything extravagant. She did not take anything extravagant, but she obeyed the eunuch who was preparing her to meet the king. And why is that significant? Because the eunuch knows what the king wants. The eunuch knows what the king wants. And so sometimes we see Esther here now, as she did with Mordecai, worked with the eunuch, she worked with Mordecai to be able to reach where she reached as queen. And this shows the importance of the synergy between men and women and our ability to accomplish more together than we are able to do apart. And the context or the story itself is not one-sided in that Esther only listened to Mordecai. But the time came when Esther had to instruct Mordecai as it relates to what to do. But when we get to that chapter, we will discuss that. So we are seeing the synergy between men and women working together and the outcomes that can be produced. And so Mordecai was a wise, God-fearing man, and that's my deduction. That's my deduction from the text, because it it was evident in the way he groomed and treated Esther, and it's kind of reflective of God's relationship with us. It's kind of reflective of God's relationship with us. He says, I will never leave you as orphans. He says, when mother and father forsake you, what I will do, I will pick you up, I will take you up, I will take you into my kingdom, I'll take you into my home, and I will care for you. And we see this very nature coming out in Mordecai and his treatment of Esther when we go back to verse 11. So at this point, Esther was in harem. And what Mordecai would have done is that the text says every day, he walked back and forth near the courtyard to find out how she was doing. So we can see here it was not a matter of him using Esther, but it was a matter of him working or trying to get the best for her because he genuinely cared about her. He genuinely cared about her well-being. And so his actions in getting her to the presence of the king to reach that queen state was out of what he think was best, not ignoring the fact that this sounds like the work of a God who knows the tomorrow of his people. He knows the tomorrow. And so we can take from this that regardless of what situations are now, God knows tomorrow. Who was Esther? Well, we would have made some mention of her. She was an orphan. Her parents died. She grew up with Mordecai. And she worked with Mordecai and the eunuch to reach to the place of importance, the place of importance. And so her partnership and her character as a person is evident in the text. She did not rebel, so that means she wasn't rebellious. She's described as obedient. And when we look at verse 7, we realize that the Bible, the text says, she was lovely in figure and was beautiful. And this language is not a foreign language. And so it is not objectifying women, because you have the case where men, the appearance of men were also brought forth. We go back and we look at Joseph. Why did Joseph was an attractive man, and that's why he was appealing, and the man wife went after him, because he was, when we look at the Hebrew boys, one of the criteria that stood out for them, and why they were chosen for the position that they were chosen for, was because of their appearance. They were handsome, they were well built, and so they had appeal. The Bible talks about David and how David was a handsome man. Talk about Absalom, how Absalom hair was long, and he was fair to look at. So the idea of, and when we go back to the first chapter, we realize that the king wanted to display Vashti, and which he objected, and it would come off as him objectifying her. Whereas that may have some validity when we understand the culture at the time, then we would get a better picture of why he did what he did. Yes, he was drunk. He was drunk, well, high in spirit. I don't think he was, the concept of drunk here or high in spirit is not consistent with what we know. And that's one of the challenges that we face in interpreting this particular passage, is that we equate what we know now to what was happening then, which was not the same thing. because the alcohol then and alcohol now are two different things. Then they had fermented drink alcohol, so they could have drank a lot of it and not get as drunk as somebody who might drink a half bottle of punching and dropping all over the place. So there is that cultural difference. And we see that playing out here when she was described as beautiful, when she was described as lovely, it was acknowledging her outward appearance for what it was. But that wasn't the only thing that stood out about Esther. Her intrinsic qualities also played a major role in her getting to that place. And we see that playing out, in the remaining chapters of the book. And we're going to look at that as well. How did she become queen? Well, she had to go through the process. And the process was she had to go through, she had to qualify to be accepted by the eunuch, which we saw that happen. She qualified without, with flying colors. She worked with the eunuch and she had to do what she did what he instructed of her to do. And then we realize that when her time came, in verse 12, before the young women who came to go to the king, she had to, complete, we will look at that, completing that 12 years. When we go to verse 15, and we see the qualities of Esther coming out. When we go to verse 15, and when it was her turn, when it was her turn to go into the king, she was asked, to bringing whatever she needed to bring. But she went ahead with what the eunuch taking care of her recommended. And when she went into the king, it was automatic. His attraction in verse 17 was almost automatic. And there is something that we want to discuss in verse 17. And if you realize, I'm just going through the different verses because, it's the best way to approach this, in my opinion, is it's almost like a summary of the whole story. And so what we see in verse 17, now the king was attracted to Esther more than any other women, and she won his favor and appeal more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And verse 18, we're going to look at verse 18 because verse 18 provides for some insight and some background to what happened in chapter 1 when Vashti was requested to come to the king. Verse 17 highlights the whole concept of marriage. Though it is not explicit in terms of its saying that, it provides some understanding into marriage. So we see, when we examine it, At this time, Esther went into the king after other women had gone in. After other women had gone in. So the question is, what happened to the women before Esther? What happened to them? Well, based on what was cultural, polygamy was cultural, not divinely ordered. So let me see that. Not divinely ordered. When you go back to Genesis, we understand that God says, for this reason I make a man and a woman. And a husband should be of, a wife. A husband should be a husband to one wife, and a wife to one husband. So there is that one and one union. So polygamy was never God's intention. Was never God's intention. However, in the day, it was culturally accepted and tolerated. It was culturally accepted and tolerated. And so it was a regular practice, not because God says that's how it should be. So the question of what happened to the other women is that once they entered the king's palace, there are two classifications: queen and concubine. Right? So you're either the queen or you're the concubine. Concubine are legitimate wives. The concubines are legitimate wives, but you have status. So based on the culture of the day and the law of the day, those who entered into this, one author describes it as a pageant. A pageant with the crown being the chief reward. So that's what they're going for. But once the virgins spend the night with the king, they automatically become his wife. However, it does not mean that they become queen, because queen is a higher status. It's a higher status. And where we see this happening, when we go back to Genesis and we see Abraham and Sarah, and when Sarah, being the legitimate wife, said to him, go and sleep with Hagar so that you can have the son that God wants. She made him a wife to Abraham by doing that, and she would be considered a concubine, but she was not the entitled wife. She was not the entitled wife. And so when we hear about Solomon having 700 concubines, and there is only one queen, only one person can be queen, and that person is the legal, official wife. She has all the say, she has all the legal backing. Concubines often serve as childbearers or sex partners. And so concubines are usually child bearers or sex partners, but they don't hold the position of queen. And that's what was happening here. So the text tells us that once the women spend the night with the king, one of two things will happen. One of two things will happen. One is either they will be sent to another part. When we see this in verse 14, in the evening, she would go there and in the morning return to another part of her harem to the care of that person, who is the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. So they automatically become concubines, but that wasn't what happened with Esther. That was not what happened with Esther. After the king, well, the text didn't even say it was after the morning the king crowned him. In verse 17, it says, "Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and won his favor and approval more than any other virgin. So he set the royal crown on her head." The supposition here is that they did spend the night, and they did have sexual encounter. That's what I'm supposing here. Or the other possibility is that he was, upon his meeting her, he would have, felt whimsically in love with her, and so he crowned her. And that, my friends, could not be something ordinary. That could not be something ordinary. And again, the implied theology here. God was the one who prepared Esther for this. God was the one who prepared Esther. So we're going with the idea that there were 400 women. Based on what verse 17 says, he was attracted to her more than everybody else. She won his favor and approval above anybody else. Keeping in mind that the women who were involved in this process had to be among the most beautiful women, in the kingdom. So by that very nature, we understand that this has to be the creme de la creme of women or virgins in the kingdom. And so for the king to just reach to that point where he recognized Esther and he became fond of Esther above all the other women, suggests to me that God was at work. Again, God knows what he is doing. God knows what he's doing. And so, as I explained before, she became queen, the others became concubines. She has now taken the highest status of a woman in the kingdom. And when we look at verse 18, and we can contrast it with what happened in the first chapter, when Vashti was requested, it suggests to me that it was not abnormal for the king to request of his wife or the queen to be a part of the banquet that he's holding. Because what we see here in verse 18 is that the king, whereas he had asked Vashti to attend the previous banquet, in this case, he threw the banquet just for Esther, to celebrate Esther. And yes, we could argue that there is a difference here in that he wanted to put Vashti on display, and in this sense, he wanted to celebrate Esther. That's how impressed he was with her. And so that can't just be because of appearance. And so the understanding I have here is it was not unusual, at least for this king, to present his queen to the nobles and the officials. In fact, he went as far as to have a holiday throughout the province and to distribute royal gifts just to celebrate Esther. The message to us as believers, as I conclude, is that we don't need to compromise ourselves to gain approval or reach to the highest levels in life. We don't have to sell our souls. We don't need to sell our souls. We don't need to surrender our core values. We don't need to surrender our righteousness. We don't need to surrender our relationship with God. If we act in faith and obedience and keeping the will of God on the forefront of our minds, even as we see with Esther, even the king approved of her and celebrated her. I guess he didn't know she was a Jewish person, which we see in verse 10, where we're told that Mordecai insisted that she did not display her family lineage. If she had done that, maybe things would have been different. And I'm going to speculate here. My speculation is things may have been different, not because of who the king was, but because of the religious conflict that was evident or was taking place at the time. There was a religious tug of war, and then we see later in the past in the book where the Jews were destined to be wiped out, and that is evidence of the religious conflict that existed there. So had he known, maybe things would have been different. The question is, did she lie? My answer, well, I really can't give an answer for that, but my theory is she did not tell him. Was it a requirement to disclose? What is the requirement to disclose nationality? I don't get the impression from the text. The qualification is that you must be of the most beautiful within the province. And so she not telling him, was it deception? Was it not deception? That can swing either way. But what we do know is that Mordecai instructed her not to disclose her family lineage. And was she asked about it? I don't know. Was it a requirement? I don't know. Was it necessary to say she was? I don't think so. I don't think so. And so that's my thought on that. So that's just a summary of these verses. And so we're going to open the floor for dialogue.